The boy's hands trembled as he reached toward the billionaire's silent child. "Don't move," he whispered. "There's something alive in your ear." Security froze. The crowd gasped, and before anyone could stop him, the barefoot black boy pulled out a dark, wriggling shape that made everyone step back. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the 10-year-old white boy, deaf since the age of 2, blinked, turned his head, and said one word no one had heard from him in years: Dad. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them. The marble courtyard of Grant Biotech had never been this quiet. Cameras kept flashing. Executives whispered in disbelief. At the center stood Tyrone Brooks, a 12-year-old homeless black kid who spent most nights behind the subway vent near the company gates. And kneeling before him, his face pale with shock, was Richard Coleman, Billionaire CEO, clutching his son Ethan like he was seeing him for the first time. Richard's voice broke. "Ethan, you can hear me?" The boy nodded, eyes wide with tears. Every guard who once chased Tyrone away now just stared motionless, as if the laws of science had been in front of them. Reporters pushed forward. "How did you do that, kid?" Tyrone rubbed his fingers on his ripped t-shirt. "It was a bug. Been in there for years. Nobody looked right." Simple words. But they hit Richard like thunder. For 8 years, the richest doctors in the country had tested, scanned, and cut. Every treatment failed. Every appointment cost thousands. And yet, one barefoot boy had done in 10 seconds what medicine couldn't in a decade. Richard looked up at the glass walls of his own building, at the logo that read Innovation for Humanity. He suddenly realized he didn't know what humanity meant anymore. The boy stepped back slowly, expecting to be yelled at or dragged away. Instead, Richard stood, eyes burning. "What's your name, son?" "Tyrone, sir." "Well, Tyrone, you just gave me my boy back." Cameras clicked again, but this time the photos captured something no one expected. A billionaire hugging a homeless black kid in front of his own empire. The next morning, the marble silence of the Coleman mansion felt heavier than ever. Ethan ran across the living room shouting, testing every new sound like a miracle he didn't want to lose. But Richard's smile kept fading each time he looked at him. Something inside refused to believe that all those years of surgeries, specialists, and donations had missed something so simple. The TV played the news loop again. Homeless boy cures billionaire son. World stunned. Reporters called it fate. Richard called it fraud. He stormed into his study and dialed his chief physician. "Dr. Stevens, I need you at my office. Now." An hour later, the man arrived. Expensive suit, calm face. That practiced professional smile. Richard didn't offer a seat. He slammed a folder onto the desk. 6 years of scans, tests, and invoices. $8 million. Tell me how a child on the street found what your entire team never saw. The doctor adjusted his tie. "Mr. Coleman," sometimes spontaneous neural reconnections. Richard cut him off. "Don't feed me that textbook garbage." There was a living insect in his ear. "Stevens, did no one ever bother to look?" For the first time, the man's composure cracked. "Well, such cases are rare. Our focus was on neurological pathways, not ear canals. Because checking an ear canal doesn't make you money, does it?" Richard shot back. The room went silent. Ethan's laughter echoed faintly from the hall, piercing the tension. Richard leaned forward, voice low but shaking. "You told me he needed another procedure last month. You wanted $400,000 more. Those were necessary precautions, necessary to keep billing me." He threw the folder across the table. Paper scattered like broken promises. "I paid for hope while my boys suffered because you didn't care to see." Dr. Stevens picked up his briefcase. "If you continue this tone, I'll involve my lawyers." "Good," Richard hissed. "Bring them. I'll bring the truth." As the door slammed behind the doctor, Richard stood still, fists clenched. For the first time, his anger wasn't toward fate. It was toward a system that had looked at his money, not his child. He glanced at the news still looping on the screen, Tyrone's face smiling shyly beside Ethan. Maybe the boy hadn't just given him his son back. Maybe he'd shown him who the real enemy was. Rain tapped against the tinted windows of the black sedan as it rolled through downtown. Richard Coleman sat in the back seat, lost in thought, the city lights flickering across his face like a confession he couldn't escape. Every test result, every specialist, every check he'd ever signed, worthless. And one barefoot boy had seen what 8 years of medical experts refused to notice. He told his driver to stop at the underpass near the old train line. That's where they said the homeless kids usually slept. He stepped out, rain soaking his shoes, searching through cardboard shelters and rusted shopping carts until he heard a familiar voice. Mr. Coleman. Tyrone Brooks stepped out from behind a pillar, wearing the same torn hoodie from yesterday. Did I do something wrong? The boy asked quietly. Richard shook his head. You did everything right, son. But I need to know, how did you even notice what no one else did? Tyrone looked down. My little brother, Marcus, he died 2 years ago. He used to say he couldn't hear good. Mama took him to a free clinic. They never checked his ear either. By the time someone did, it was too late. I just saw the same thing in your boy's eyes. Richard's throat tightened. This kid wasn't lucky. He was scarred by the same system that nearly destroyed his own family. You mean you lost your brother because no one cared to look? Tyrone nodded slowly. They looked at our skin first, not the problem. That line hit harder than any storm outside. Richard, the billionaire who prided himself on philanthropy, suddenly realized he'd been funding the same institutions that ignored kids like Tyrone. He crouched so their eyes met. You said you saw it in Ethan's eyes. What else did you see? That he's got a dad who actually came back for him. Richard blinked, silent. The boy's words carried more truth than every doctor he'd ever met. He handed Tyrone a dry towel from his coat pocket. You saved my son, but something tells me it wasn't an accident. You knew what to look for. Tyrone hesitated, then pulled out a small, cracked phone. I record stuff sometimes. Hospitals, clinics, people like me getting turned away. I got videos of kids still waiting to be treated while rich patients skipped the line. Richard's eyes widened. You have proof? Lots, Tyrone said, but no one listens to us. Richard looked toward the city skyline, the towers bearing his company's name. Then they'll listen now. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. Help me find out how deep this goes. I've got resources. You've got the truth. Tyrone smiled faintly. You sure about that? People like me disappear when we start talking. Then you're not disappearing, Richard replied firmly. You're coming with me. They both turned toward the storm, walking side by side, the billionaire and the boy the world forgot. That night, a partnership was born in silence, the kind that comes right before war. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. Days turned into restless nights as Richard and Tyrone built an alliance the world wasn't ready to see. One man had the power. The other had the eyes that power never noticed. In a dim hotel room across from the hospital, Tyrone spread out old files and scribbled notes across the bed. They call these treatment plans, he said, showing pages marked experimental and long-term patient. Same names show up on every file. Kids from rich families. But the ones who can't pay? Their folders end with a red X. Richard stared at the papers, disbelief mixing with guilt. My own company's research fund sponsors some of these clinics, he muttered. Then they're using your name to keep people sick. Tyrone replied quietly. They move like ghosts through corridors of privilege. Tyrone posed as a janitor, pushing an old cleaning cart with a hidden phone taped under the handle. Richard slipped into meetings under fake identities, recording doctors boasting about long-term care revenue. Each night, they'd meet again, piecing together a puzzle darker than either imagined. Audio files, secret payments, falsified reports, all pointing to one man, Dr. Harrison, head of the National Pediatric Council. One recording still echoed in Richard's mind. Dr. Harrison's voice. Parents pay for hope. As long as they believe, the bill never ends. That sentence burned itself into Richard's chest like fire. Tyrone clenched his fists. They let my brother die for that hope. Richard looked at him, eyes steady. Then let's make them choke on it. They began leaking small clips online under an anonymous account. Whispers spread. Parents started questioning bills. By the fifth night, one nurse secretly slipped Tyrone a folder. Inside were meeting notes titled Special Studies Group Confidential. A list of 47 children, all under observation, all unnecessary treatments. Richard exhaled sharply. This is it. This proves they know. But before he could celebrate, Tyrone's phone buzzed. Unknown number. One-line text. Stop digging, or you'll end up like your brother. The room went silent. Tyrone looked up slowly. They know it's us. Richard nodded, jaw tight. Then we're close. He opened his laptop, forwarding the evidence to 3 trusted contacts, lawyers, journalists, and one detective he still believed in. This isn't just malpractice, he said. It's organized fraud. A criminal ring hiding behind lab coats. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, as if warning what came next. Inside, a billionaire and a street kid prepared to walk straight into the storm they'd uncovered. The night of the special meeting came wrapped in silence and rain. Dr. Harrison's office tower loomed like a cathedral of arrogance, glass walls glowing over a city that never cared to look beneath them. Inside the duct above the boardroom, Tyrone crouched with a tiny recorder clutched in his hand. Below him, 6 of the country's most respected doctors laughed over $100 whiskey. Richard listened through an earpiece in the parking lot, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on a tower clock ticking toward 8 p.m. Gentlemen, Dr. Harrison began, tapping his pen. We have a problem. Coleman is asking questions. Laughter circled the table. Let him. Another doctor sneered. Rich men always cool off once their lawyers call. Harrison's voice sharpened. It's not just him. There's a kid involved, a street rat. He was seen at the clinic again. Tyrone's heart thudded. They were talking about him. What's our plan? One asked. Simple, Harrison said. We'll call the press tomorrow. Announce a relapse in the Coleman boy's condition. Blame spontaneous regression. Parents panic. Story dies. Donations keep coming. The others nodded like wolves agreeing on a kill. Tyrone pressed record. Every word, every laugh, every name. But then one doctor, Morrison, reached for another file. 47 active cases, he said, flipping pages. Kids kept in treatment purely for study metrics. Their parents pay our mortgages. Harrison smirked. Let's toast to the future. Long treatments, short memories. That was the line Richard had been waiting for. He whispered into his mic, Got it, Tyrone. Get out. But just as the boy started crawling back, his elbow hit a loose bolt. Clank. Every head below snapped upward. What was that? Before he could move, Harrison spotted the thin black wire dangling from a vent. Someone's recording us, he shouted. Tyrone's breath froze. The vent door burst open. He fell through the ceiling, landing on the polished table with a crash of glass and spilled liquor. The doctors jumped back. Tyrone stood, trembling but defiant, the recorder still running. Keep talking, doctors, he said. You're live. What? Harrison gasped. The boy turned the screen toward them, a red streaming icon flashing. Say hi to 40,000 viewers, he whispered. Panic exploded. Morrison lunged, but the office door swung open, and Richard Coleman walked in flanked by 2 detectives and a district attorney. Good evening, gentlemen, Richard said, his voice colder than the rain outside. I hope the drinks were worth your careers. The detective stepped forward. You're under investigation for medical fraud, child endangerment, and conspiracy. The doctor's faces drained of color. Richard glanced at Tyrone. Uploads complete? The boy nodded. All of it. Harrison whispered, You can't do this to us. Richard stared back. You did it to yourselves. Outside, sirens wailed as news vans arrived. Inside, a corrupt empire collapsed, not with silence, but with evidence. The video spread faster than wildfire. By sunrise, every news outlet in America had replayed the moment 6 doctors were caught bragging about keeping children sick for profit. 47 names. 47 families. The comments flooded in like a storm of truth no one could contain. That's my daughter on the list. My son died under Dr. Morrison's care. We paid everything we had for lies. Reporters camped outside hospital gates. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice for the Invisible." And for the first time, the world looked at a homeless black boy and didn't see a statistic. They saw a hero. Inside his penthouse, Richard watched the chaos unfold on 3 screens. Every headline carried Tyrone's name. He should have felt relief. But all he felt was guilt, that it took a child's courage to do what men like him never dared. The phone rang. "Mr. Coleman, the Attorney General wants a full briefing at noon. The board is resigning. They're calling you the whistleblower." Richard exhaled. "No, Tyrone is." At that same moment, Tyrone stood on the courthouse steps surrounded by microphones too big for his hands. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. He simply said, "We just wanted them to stop lying." That one line became the headline across every screen in the country. By evening, warrants turned into handcuffs. Dr. Harrison and his colleagues were escorted out of their offices in silence, their coats replaced by cuffs, their arrogance by fear. The same walls that once hid their crimes now echoed with the sound of justice. When the judge denied their bail, the courtroom erupted. Dozens of parents cried, holding pictures of their children. Richard sat beside Tyrone, both quiet, both exhausted. He looked at the boy and whispered, "You changed everything." Tyrone smiled faintly. "I just told the truth." As they stepped outside into the flash of cameras, rain began to fall again. Soft, steady, cleansing. The same kind of rain that once hid the city's sins now washed its streets clean. 6 months later, the marble sign outside a downtown clinic read, "The Marcus Grant Foundation for Medical Transparency," named after a brother who was ignored and a child who was finally heard. Inside, the halls were filled with laughter. Children receiving free checkups from volunteer doctors who swore an oath to honesty first, profit never. Richard Coleman walked through those halls not as a billionaire, but as a man trying to fix the world his money once fed. In one of the exam rooms, Tyrone helped a little girl climb onto the bed. He checked her ear with a small magnifying scope. "Perfect," he said, smiling. "No bugs this time." The girl giggled, and Richard watched in the doorway with quiet pride. "College starts next month," he said. Tyrone shrugged. "They said I could study forensic medicine early. Guess I've got a head start." "You've got more than that," Richard replied softly. "You've got purpose." Across town, Dr. Harrison sat alone in a rented room. The hum of a broken fan, the only sound left in his life. Every license revoked. Every asset gone. The once untouchable doctor was now a forgotten name in a forgotten scandal. A lesson carved into the stone of justice. Meanwhile, the Foundation's first open day event drew hundreds. Parents, reporters, and children filled the courtyard where Ethan had once stood in silence. Now his voice led the crowd. "My name is Ethan Coleman," he said into the microphone. "For 8 years I couldn't hear. Not because healing was impossible, but because greed was louder than truth. But Tyrone taught me something. Heroes aren't the ones we see on TV. They're the ones we walk past every day." Applause thundered. Tyrone joined him on stage, both smiling beneath the evening sun that broke through the clouds. Richard stepped forward, resting a hand on their shoulders. "For years, silence was our curse. Today, it's our proof that even the smallest voice can shake an empire." As the crowd rose to their feet, cameras flashed again. Only this time, it wasn't scandal. It was hope. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice